What if I told you that the most impressive lap of the second week in Bahrain was not simply talent, but the demonstration of a hidden system that could be playing at the limit of the regulations? Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. Because what the SF-26 showed was not just speed. It was a car that changes its behavior within the same curve. It brakes as if it were on rails, rotates with an almost artificial precision, and accelerates when others have already exhausted their electrical energy. And the most disturbing thing is not that Ferrari was fast. The most disturbing thing is that everything seems to be within the law. Today we are going to unravel the hidden trick of the SF-26 that shocked Red Bull, Mercedes, and McLaren in the second week of Bahrain, and why it could be the first big technical blow of a new cycle. What we saw in the second week of testing in Bahrain was not simply a timetable with Ferrari on top. It was something much deeper. It was the feeling, shared silently in the paddock, that the SF-26 does not behave like a conventional car under the new regulations. While other teams were working to understand their operating window, manage temperatures, and fine-tune basic hybrid maps, Ferrari seemed to be operating on another layer of performance, a layer that is not evident to the naked eye, but that reveals itself when you take a closer look at the telemetry. Charles Leclerc's return was not shocking just because of the stopwatch. It was shocking because of how it was built. Under braking, the car seemed incredibly planted, without those micro movements of the rear axle that we saw in other cars during the week. At the apex, it rotated with an almost artificial neutrality, as if the balance were millimetrically calculated so as not to punish the front tire. And on departure, when the pilot normally has to modulate the throttle to avoid overheating or loss of traction, the SF-26 simply pulled with surgical progressiveness, extending the electrical delivery beyond the point at which the others had already exhausted their thrust. That's where the real story begins, because it is not a one-time improvement, nor a slightly more efficient spoiler, nor a simple mechanical optimization. What Ferrari seems to have achieved is to synchronize three dimensions of the car that normally operate almost independently: the front suspension geometry with optimized anti-dive, the active aerodynamics within the margin allowed by the 2026 regulation, and an extremely refined hybrid management that does not release all its power at once, but distributes it strategically along the straight. That synchronization creates a cumulative effect, is not a performance peak, is a more sustained yield curve. At Sakhir, a circuit that combines hard braking, medium speed direction changes, and long straights, where efficiency is everything, that concept fit like a perfect piece in the puzzle. Ferrari wasn't just fast on one lap, he was consistent in long runs, repeating strong beats without showing the peaks of degradation that affected others. And that, on a track where thermal management is usually the great enemy, is a declaration of intent, but there is an important nuance that adds tension to this scenario. The dynamic behavior of the SF-26 itself, its ability to change modes within the same curve, suggests that the car is operating in a very precise window. A window where height, temperature, mechanical balance, and electrical deployment must align almost perfectly. When everything comes together, the car seems unbeatable. The question that is beginning to arise in the paddock is not only if Ferrari has found something brilliant, but if that something can be replicated by others, or if we are facing a structural advantage that can condition the start of the season. Because the second week in Bahrain didn't just leave better weather. It left a collective feeling. Ferrari is not simply competing within the new regulations. He is interpreting it at the limit of his technical elasticity. And when that happens in Formula One, the rest of the grid doesn't take long to react. The first thing that worries is not the isolated top speed, but the way in which Ferrari builds it. The GPS data clearly shows that the SF-26 does not release all the electrical energy at the beginning of the straight, as many teams do to maximize the initial peak. Instead, delivery is progressive. That means that when the rival has already consumed the most aggressive part of the hybrid deployment, the Ferrari keeps pushing. It is not an explosive blow. It is a constant pressure that is maintained until the end of the straight. And in Sakhir, where every meter of acceleration counts, that difference translates into meters gained without seeming dramatic. This energy management is closely connected to aerodynamic behavior. The famous V-shaped diffuser is not simply an extreme solution to generate more rear load. It is a piece that seems to work in sync with the active aero, modifying the balance between drag and support in very specific phases of the curve. There has even been talk of a DRS 2.0 mode within the law because the car manages to gain on the order of several kilometers per hour on the straight without losing stability in the middle sector. It is not a binary high load or low load configuration. It is a more nuanced, more intelligent, more adaptive transition. And that's where the front suspension comes into play. The optimized anti-dive allows the car to remain stable under very strong braking, especially in T1 and T10 in Bahrain, where the weight transfer usually punishes the front axle. By reducing pitching and stabilizing the aerodynamic platform, Ferrari ensures that the flow under the car is not abruptly altered at corner entry. That stability is the foundation that allows the rest of the active aero system and hybrid deployment to operate within the ideal window. The result of this integration is a car that seems to change modes within the same curve. At the entrance, it is mechanically solid. In the center is aerodynamically neutral. At the exit, it transforms into a traction machine with modulated electrical delivery. For the spectator, it is a clean return. For the rival engineer, it is a conceptual nightmare because it is not a single isolated innovation that can be copied in a few weeks. It is a behavioral architecture. But that architecture has a price. The first days in Bahrain already showed tunnel track correlation problems. The radical diffuser generated stall episodes in crosswind conditions. When the flow partially detaches at the rear, the head loss can be sudden and difficult to predict. Ferrari used a lot of FlowViz paint on the floor and lower area of the car to verify that the actual behavior matched what the CFD and tunnel promised. That level of visual validation is no coincidence. It indicates that the team nose is working very close to the aerodynamic limit. Furthermore, this dynamic mode does not work automatically. It depends on an extremely precise alignment of variables: car height, tire temperature, hybrid map, mechanical balance, and track condition. When everything comes together, the SF26 seems unbeatable. But if one of those variables moves slightly out of range, the advantage can evaporate. That introduces enormous operational risk. In a test with relatively controlled conditions, you can maximize the window. In a real race, with traffic, dirty air, and wind changes, the story may be different. And here the third element of tension appears: the regulations. Some analyzers already describe the behavior of the Ferrari as delicately regulatory. The synchronization between permitted aerodynamic changes and energy management could be bordering on interpretations that other teams have not explored or have not dared to explore. When a car appears to adjust charge states within the curve so fluidly, questions inevitably arise. There are no public protests yet, but there are long glances in technical meetings and conversations in low voices about possible technical clarifications from the FIA. Meanwhile, the practical advantage is clear. In the second week of Bahrain, Ferrari not only scored an impressive lap, it showed the ability to repeat performance in long stints with controlled degradation and a solid database after accumulating high mileage without major reliability problems. For such a sophisticated concept, that's almost more important than the best time. That's why the impact was so strong, because what the rivals saw was not a car that had got the setup right. It was a car that seems to have understood before anyone else how to connect mechanics, aerodynamics, and power into a single technical narrative. And in Formula One, when someone finds that coherence before the others, the rest don't just lose time on the track. Waste time trying to understand where to start copying. What the second week in Bahrain left behind was not simply a sense of optimism in Maranello. It was a quiet alteration in the perception of the competitive order. For months, the narrative pointed to a more compressed grid, a regulation that would equalize forces, and a progressive transition towards 2026 where no one would have a clear structural advantage. However, Leclerc's return, and above all, the way the SF26 built its performance, broke that expectation. Because when you analyze braking stability, neutrality in the center of the curve, progressive traction, straight line efficiency, and repeatability in long runs, you are not looking at a car that depends on a specific track condition. You are looking at an integrated concept. And in Formula One, when the base concept is solid, subsequent evolutions are not patches. They are amplifiers. That is the real concern of Red Bull, Mercedes, and McLaren after Sakhir. Is not that Ferrari has found a circumstantial 3/10 on a circuit that historically suits them well. They have shown to understand how to exploit the interaction between active aero, suspension, and hybrid energy before the rest. And when that understanding is deep, the room for improvement may still be greater than current times suggest. However, SF26's own DNA introduces an internal tension. The car seems extremely sensitive to its operating window. When everything is aligned, the result is almost perfect. But that perfection depends on surgical precision. In a real race, with traffic, turbulence, wind changes, and unpredictable degradation, Maintaining that balance will be the real test. The second week of testing showed the ceiling of the concept. The season will show its soil. What Leclerc did was not only set a reference on the stopwatch, it was showing the maximum potential of a concept that, when it enters its ideal window, seems to operate in another dimension. The SF-26 does not rely on a single strength. His threat is in the sum. Stability under braking, clean transition in the center of the curve, progressive traction on exit, and sustained efficiency on the straight. It is not an isolated peak. It is a longer and more constant performance curve. But every brilliant concept has its fragility. Extreme sensitivity to conditions, the risk of falling outside the optimal window, and the inevitable scrutiny from the FIA on any system that appears too perfect are all part of the price of innovating at the limit. Ferrari has decided to walk that fine line between genius and technical vulnerability. And that makes the outcome even more interesting. The real test will begin when the lights go out in the real race, when there is traffic, dirty air, strategic pressure, and unpredictable degradation. There we will know if what we saw in Sakhir was a brilliant flash in controlled conditions or the first indication of a structural advantage that can redefine the start of the championship. Because if the second week in Bahrain taught us anything, it is that Ferrari is not waiting to adapt to the new technical cycle. He's trying to lead it. And in Formula One, when someone takes the conceptual initiative before the rest, the reaction does not take long to arrive, but is rarely immediate. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.